Okay, so diving into Kant's fundamental principles of the metaphysics of morals, the first section, Kant begins by talking about something he calls the good will. So what I'll do is I'll actually read through the first 3 paragraphs of this section and just kind of explain as I'm reading through what Kant is saying about this thing, the good will. Kant begins, "Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification, except a good will." Okay, so at this point we can pause for a moment and ask, what do we think Kant means by will here? He doesn't define it. He doesn't tell us for sure what he means, but we have a kind of general sense of the language, and goodwill is a pretty good translation of the German here. So what do we think Kant means by this? In order to understand this better, I would encourage you just to actually take a moment and try to answer the question, what is a will? What do we mean when we use that word will in the sense of it was my will to do that, or I willed this result? What do we mean by that? Okay, so just take a moment and maybe jot down your answer, and I'll give you a few moments, and then I'll present to you a kind of possible definition. Okay, so some things that you might have said when you jotted down your answer are that a will is a decision, or it's a choice, or it's a motive, or it's an intention. All those are pretty close to what a will is. But if you think about it, a will also involves some kind of motive power or force or starting of action in the direction of whatever it is that's willed. So will usually involves not just a decision, but also the beginning of action in direction of whatever it is that one has decided. Okay, so it's a little bit puzzling to think about how it is that we can have a will. And in fact, there is the famous philosophical dilemma or debate about free will. Do we really have wills that are free, or is our will determined by, for instance, things that happen in our brains, or things that have happened to us in our history, in our childhood, or our genetics, or some combination of those things? Okay, and I won't get into the details of that problem right now, but just to try to kind of clarify what is the concept of a will, it's a little bit, potentially a little bit complicated to answer that question in a way that is satisfactory. But it means something like intention plus a little bit of the action in the direction of whatever it is that one intends. Okay, let's go on now to see what Kant says about this will. So he says, intelligence, wit, judgment, and other talents of the mind, however they may be named, or courage, resolution, perseverance, as qualities of temperament, are undoubtedly good and desirable in many respects. But these gifts of nature may also become extremely bad and mischievous if the will, which is to make use of them, and which therefore constitutes what is called character, is not good. So notice that the list of things in the beginning of this sentence, intelligence, wit, judgment, courage, resolution, perseverance, particularly that last set, courage, resolution, perseverance, these talents or qualities of temperament are actually very similar to what Aristotle called virtues. And some of his examples of virtues, he even uses the same words like courage. Okay, so and it's quite possible that what Kant had in mind here was in fact Aristotle and Aristotelians of Kant's own time, because there were plenty of people defending Kant's views and Kantian ethical views in Kant's time as well as in our own. And so he's in a way here criticizing those views. He's pointing to something other than these talents of the mind or qualities of temperament that needs to be good in order for those things to be good. And this condition of the goodness of these other things, this thing that he's pointing to that he says is the condition of the goodness of these other things, is the good will. Why does Kant say this? Well, if you think about it for a minute, it is true that someone who has a lot of courage, resolution, perseverance, intelligence, wit, and judgment, but has a bad will, can actually do a lot more damage with those seemingly positive qualities of temperament. Because if they're courageous in the service of defending a bad aim, that is, if their will is bad, if their will is to cause harm and suffering, for instance, okay, cause as much harm and suffering as possible, then what they're willing is bad. Their will is bad. And so the qualities of temperament, of courage and intelligence, and so on, these things that are listed in the first part of the sentence, actually end up working in the service of a bad end. Okay, so that's part of the reason why we might agree with Kant here that a good will is a condition of the goodness of these other things. And in the last part of this paragraph, Kant actually increases the list of things that are good only dependent on a good will. So he writes, "It is the same with the gifts of fortune. Power, riches, honor, even health, and the general well-being and contentment with one's condition, which is called happiness, inspire pride and often presumption if there is not a good will to correct the influence of these on the mind, and with this also to rectify the whole principle of acting and adapt it to its end." So here he's taking aim at a lot of things that Aristotle had mentioned, okay? Power, riches, honor, health, and also what Aristotle himself said was the highest good, which is happiness, the chief good. Kant is saying actually that can't be the chief good because it's only good if a person who has it is also has a good will. So the goodness of happiness depends as well on the goodness of the will, according to Kant. Okay, so this is actually a very big reversal or objection or contrary view to Aristotle's, because Kant is saying that the will is the primary thing that needs to be good. The good will is the only thing that's good without qualification. Okay, now Kant isn't quite thinking about this goodwill in the same way that Aristotle thinks about the chief good as the end or aim of all of our actions. Kant isn't bringing, it doesn't include in his theory that idea that all of our actions are aiming at some end, probably because he doesn't quite agree with it. It's a little bit complicated, but we don't need to, I'm sorry, we don't need to get into it. I'll just say that when he says that nothing can be conceived in the world that is good without qualification except a goodwill, he's placing the goodwill in the primary place as far as what makes something good or bad. Okay, so it's no longer happiness for Kant. He's saying it's the good will. And in the next paragraph, Kant goes on basically making the same point that he made in the past paragraph, but with more examples. So he says, there are even some qualities which are of service to this goodwill itself and may facilitate its action, yet which have no intrinsic unconditional value, but always presuppose a goodwill. And this qualifies the esteem that we justly have for them and does not permit us to regard them as absolutely good. And then here's the example. Moderation in the affections and passions, self-control, and calm deliberation are not only good in many respects, but even seem to constitute part of the intrinsic worth of the person. So he's basically just saying we really think these things are good. They even seem to somehow be almost definitional of the goodness of somebody. And we might wonder whether that's true, but that's what Kant says here, that we think these things are especially good. But he goes on to make the same point about them, that they're only good under the assumption that the person who has them also has a good will. So their goodness is actually conditional on the goodwill, Kant says. But they are far from deserving to be called good without qualification, although they have been so unconditionally praised by the ancients. And again, Kant is probably thinking of either Aristotle or other contemporaries of Aristotle, or those who came shortly after Aristotle, including perhaps the Stoics. So Kant goes on to explain why he thinks these things are only good conditional on the goodwill. For without the principles of a goodwill, they may become extremely bad, and the coolness of a villain not only makes him far more dangerous, but also directly makes him more abominable, that is, bad or reprehensible, in our eyes than he would have been without it. Okay, so what Kant is asking us to imagine here is, imagine somebody who has moderation in their affections and passions. They have self-control and calm deliberation, these things that are supposedly very good characteristics for a person to have. Okay, and now imagine the person does not have a good will, but actually has an evil will, that they want to do evil. Okay, such a person, right, this villain who is also cool, right, cool in the sense of not they don't get upset, they don't get passionate, they just relentlessly kill innocent people, or whatever it is that they're doing that is that is evil, that's consistent with their evil will rather than their good will. So Kant is saying the fact that they're not getting upset about it or passionate or anything, that they're just coolly carrying out these evil actions, is a reason for us to think that they're more scary and more evil than they would have been otherwise. So again, it's not that these things are always intrinsically good just in themselves. Their goodness depends on the goodwill. And then in the next paragraph, Kant goes on making basically the same point, but he's going to extend this point a little bit in kind of a sideways direction. And what he has to say here is a little bit controversial, but I'll try to make sense of it and make it as convincing as I can. So he says, a good will is good not because of what it performs or effects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition. That is, it is good in itself, and considered by itself to be esteemed much higher than all that can be brought about by it in favor of any inclination, nay, even of the sum total of all inclinations. So what does Kant have in mind here? He's going to say a little bit more about what he has in mind, but basically he's saying the goodness of the goodwill depends only on the orientation of the will itself. That is, it depends only on what it is that the person wants to accomplish, okay? Or what it is that motivates the person to behave as they're behaving. So let me give you an example that helps to make this clear. So imagine that there are two doctors, and one of these doctors is very meticulous in their training. They worked very hard in medical school to acquire the skills that they have, and they have every reason to believe that they're a highly competent doctor to perform the kinds of surgeries that they perform. Say they're a surgeon, okay? But it just so happens that over the course of 3 months performing a particular kind of surgery, every one of their patients dies. And these are not surgeries that normally would result in the death of patients, but say 30 patients die as a result of their surgeries. And it's not that they haven't paid enough attention to the details of the surgeries or anything like that. It's just that maybe their skills aren't adequate to the job somehow for some unknown reason. Anyway, for whatever reason, the results of their actions are that people die. And now imagine there's a second doctor, and this doctor is extremely selfish. Basically, they just partied their way through med school and they didn't pay attention. They don't really care about patients. They're just in medicine to make money, and they don't even care whether their surgery patients live or die. But it just so happens that over the past 3 months, all of the patients that they've treated have had excellent outcomes and have done very well. Maybe because this doctor has some special talent, maybe that they don't themselves understand. So the question is, which one is the morally better doctor? Okay, which one is the morally better person? Or which one is more moral? Okay, Which one is the better in the sense of that they're a better person in a moral sense? Now, if you think like Kant does about the good will, then it seems like the first doctor is the better doctor, morally speaking, okay? They may not be a better doctor in terms of medical practice, but they're a better doctor in terms of morality because they have a good will, okay? Their intentions are good, whereas the second doctor has a bad will. Okay, so if you agree with that reading of this case, and you might not, okay, you might disagree with it. Some people have argued with Kant about the interpretation of cases like this. But if you agree with that interpretation of the case, it's probably because, or it may be because you agree with Kant that what's really important for morality is not the outcomes of our actions, but it's rather our intentions. That's how actors or agents, people like us that make decisions, that have a will, okay, that's the way that our actions and our decisions should be judged, morally speaking, is in terms of our intentions. And Kant goes on to make this point even more clearly in the next passage. I want to just briefly mention there's a word in this passage, niggardly, which might sound like the bad N word, but it actually has no relation to that word. It's not etymologically in terms of the history of language. It comes from a completely different origin. And what that word niggardly means is basically kind of stingy. So not generous or not having much to give, okay? And so we'll see how that applies in this case. But I did want to mention that because I'm not, the word might come up as a red flag for you, but it's not related to the other word. So Kant writes, even if it should happen that, owing to the special disfavor of fortune, or the niggardly provision of a stepmotherly nature, this will should wholly lack power to accomplish its purpose. If with its greatest efforts it should yet achieve nothing, and there should remain only the good will, not to be sure a mere wish, but the summoning of all means in our power, then like a jewel it would still shine by its own light as a thing which has its whole value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither add to nor take away anything from this value. So what does Kant have in mind here? I'll give you an example that will help to make this clear. So imagine someone that is clinically depressed and they've made a commitment to meet someone else at, say, 1 p.m. on a given day. But they try as hard as they can on that day to get up and go meet the person they promised they would meet, and they just can't get out of bed. They just can't get themselves to go. So this would be a case of the will having this kind of, as Kant calls it, niggardly provision of a stepmotherly nature. It can't quite bring up enough motive force to carry out the thing that it wants to carry out. So the point here is that if the person really tries as hard as they can to motivate themselves to go, if they really want to meet their friend, not just as like a fantasy, like, oh yeah, I wanted to, but I was kind of tired. So no, but if they really try hard, they really want to go meet the person they promised they would meet, but are just not able to motivate themselves to go, then this would be a case that Kant says it still involves the goodwill. So it's not any negative reflection on the goodness of their will that they weren't able to motivate themselves and actually get up and go. It had to do with something about their internal constitution or their brain chemistry or whatever that they couldn't control, and so they can't. So again, in this case, it's not a problem with the will, and it's not an ethical failing that this person was unable to go meet the person they promised they would meet at 1 o'clock. Well, that basically wraps things up for our coverage of Kant's discussion of the good will in the first 3 paragraphs of the first section of this book, and we will continue in the next video lecture with his discussion of duty.